speaking to the unspoken, personal, and collective unmet needs is certainly a matter of opinion. Thus, this discussion reflects considering opinions that may not often be examined or heard and are presented as my personal opinion and not as fact. My hope is that this podcast would encourage more caring and careful considerations of unmet needs, with the freedom to hold on to opinion that has both structure and flexibility to process new information in the present, and not as a product of unmet needs or trauma from the past. As a result, I speak differently today than before and seek more precision and accuracy with the language I use. This podcast is also a sandbox for me to practice sharing some of my weighty considerations over the last several years using the precision of language I'm comfortable with so that I may get a sense of the impact of my language. That said, I aim to consider the paradox between vulnerability's praise in public and the shared responsibility for vulnerability's consequences within the intimacy, what's needed in deep, lifelong relationships. It's certainly compelling and indicative of examination. The definition of vulnerability in the dictionary is capable of being physically or emotionally wounded, and it came from the root for the word to wound, not to be wounded. And Wiki reference states, within the body of literature related to vulnerability, one major research stream includes the methodology behind said research, namely measuring and assessing indicators of vulnerability. These include external, sudden shocks and continual stresses, and internal indicators, such as defenselessness or inability to cope with incapacities. Vulnerability research covers a complex multidisciplinary field, including development and poverty studies, public health, climate studies, security studies, engineering, geography, political ecology, and disaster risk management, as well as risk management. And it's important to draw out the larger application of vulnerability that includes the social familiarity with it, as applied to our subject matter. The emotional and/or psychological perspectives will be considered. It's also worth sharing that when looking up the definitions, I came across an article titled "The Flip Side of Vulnerability" by Elise Lohan. Definitely don't know how to pronounce her name. Apologies. It's really well written, and it shares a similar theme to this discussion. Quote, anonymous feedback does not get your energy, and it does not deserve your vulnerability, because it is not vulnerable. Vulnerability requires mutual risk. Offering feedback, even criticism, can be vulnerable, but only if it's owned. For in public, sharing vulnerability is often a form of release, without expectation, or at least structured that way in support groups. No one else can save you but yourself, and thus the release of vulnerability within deep and close relationships comes with a shared impact and/or responsibility to manage, as vulnerability may be comprised of an unmet need for safety and outside or currently unavailable support. And that support may need to be grown or acquired. There's a saving aspect to it. The expectation when vulnerability is shared in a healthy way in society is that the expression is oriented towards a form of release rather than a need for support around safety. And maybe accordingly, when that need for support for safety is held in relationships for decades through cycles, I wonder if it's only where vulnerability is pragmatically shared that relationships are sustained, and only because of shared vulnerability and responsibility. And I do want to acknowledge both sides of the impact of social media engagement, with benefits for engagement and impact from thousands to millions of people via dialogue within the comments section. And the other side as the lack of shared responsibility within relationships due to physical proximity, hugs and deep meaning within the deeper conversations that's held when sharing vulnerability and unmet safety needs historically. And certainly contradictory to the social perspective of sharing unmet needs for safety with no expectation of pragmatic support in a healthy way. And while we have donation-based platforms to foster unmet support for different aspects of safety, I wonder if it contributes and further normalizes transactional dynamics within relationship, as it's almost completely virtual and lacking both the structure and consistency, as well as responsibility and accountability of traditional daily interaction within villages or tribal living that's been the foundation of humanity's psychological and anthropological development on which relationship has been built. Yet we are here today in 2025, and so what is appropriate for today? What's acceptable? What's normalized? And what if healing the ego was normalized, was accepted? Would that influence what's appropriate for today in the year of 2025? And so I ask, how do we heal the ego? And what does that look like in 2025? And why does it look that way personally, collectively? How do we heal with unmet needs for safety because of transactional relationships and societal expectations? And while I certainly recognize I can't say how to do that for society, I firmly believe that in addition to self-created space to process what's in the body with somatic awareness practices, that there stands a need to find a way to share what's unmet and often unacknowledged within vulnerability on social media, as well as how that relates to conditioning or contributing to social norms and acceptable standards. So that's what I've been thinking about lately. A lot of this was written on the full moon on October 5th. And I feel it's important to speak to this in my first podcast, Heal the Ego. Heal the Ego is a cycle of cultivating, pruning, harvesting, resting, preparing, and reseeding. I've found no greater single practice that facilitates the cycle better than my caring and careful considerations practice. It's been the primary source of the vitality, magnitude, depth, and quality of inner awareness. A big part of that inner awareness is learning to trust, honor, discern, condense, and integrate that insight or considerations alongside the collective and societal factors, which are not often reflective of intrapersonal support to meet needs, but instead the projected and accepted needs easily shared in society that often minimize or normalize the magnitude of unmet needs. The caring and careful considerations practice has been most responsible for the direction, protection, structure, life, and rebirth of my ego, and seeks to continue developing, trusting, and honoring my own experiences alongside the collective, to speak to unmet needs, to empower others to speak more vulnerably, to speak more authentically, and pragmatic solutions condensed in the cauldron of community. To transition a bit, I deeply feel that this theme of inauthenticity in expressing unmet needs that happens for a variety of reasons, far beyond what I stated before or have time for now, might be easily relatable to a common shortcoming of many churches that are not able to really welcome in the homeless, the pariah, the fringe demographics of society. And I'm not saying it would be easy, as there are many complicated and real safety concerns that significantly dampen what is possible. And so I ask again, how do we heal the ego? Or the experiences that still propagate pattern recognition from a place of deep unmet needs? It's here now that I'll bring up a seemingly profound and simple theme of individuals, as well as society, often compromising because of compromised unmet needs. And then the compromising becomes more normalized as a practical and personal example My ego, or personal experiences, include unexplainable dreams, supernatural experiences with ghosts, a non-human intelligent life form, animal and earth spirits, unexplainable craft that move throughout the sky, much different than flight and more related to movement, as well as one of the most confusing experiences of my life that appeared as a planet crashing into the earth. There's so much more to say here that I'm planning to do a whole episode on the supernatural in a few weeks. And so sharing those experiences and seeking relatability within a society seemingly challenged with patience, grace, and context to address unmet needs personally and collectively often ends up contributing to the normalization of collective shadow experiences amidst personal shadow dynamics in order to participate normally within society. But at what cost? And is being overworked and without deep, meaningful relationships or the time to honor those normal? When did it become normal? Can we co-create a new collective and personal normal by addressing the personal and collective shadow, the giant elephant in the room, the unmet emotional, relational, mental, and physical needs that will continue to call from within the heart, to weigh the mind, to fatigue the body? What would normal look like from a healed experience or ego of the past that's allowed permission to speak to personal and collective unmet desires of the heart, considerations of the mind, and restoration of the body? And so I ask again, how do we heal the ego? How do we heal the experiences we hold in the present with an accurate personal and collective development dynamics? Or put another way, when you're met with something you don't know, are you met with humility? Or are you met with humiliation? Do you think there are opportunities for learning and lessons along not knowing? Can you accept the ego doesn't know everything without accepting the ego's discomfort with exposure? Is there only admiration or animosity of the ego, of our experience of the world? Or is there a spectrum of unmet and unrecognizable feelings that desire attention and awareness from within inner awareness, often reflecting the authenticity of an inner child? Is there awareness of the input on personal and collective awareness that is minimized because of the normalization of accepted social dialogue? And what is the value of starting to consider the increasingly accelerating magnitude of unmet needs as the dawn rises on the horizon of AI's ability to outperform standardized, production-oriented efficiencies never meant and certainly not optimized for human workers, but rather for profitability? And so you give attention and awareness to unmet needs. Do you have to meet an external expectation? Do you have to meet an internal expectation? What changes if the expectation becomes learning? For myself, when I think of learning amidst expectation, I think of the word sovereignty. According to a DuckDuckGo AI search assist, quote, sovereignty refers to the supreme authority of a governing body to govern itself and make decisions without external influence. It encompasses the power to create laws and maintain order within a defined territory. For the purposes of this discussion, Wiki states that sovereignty of a person is, quote, the liberty to decide one's actions and thoughts. While the theme of sovereignty has been a part of several of the most significant experiences of my life, it remains an area of unmet needs, both personally and collectively. And for myself, there's an unmet need to more accurately speak to the unmet and unfairly designated expectations I and society had on myself in the past most significant experiences of my life. Living overseas and meeting profound confusion and immense human suffering amidst a hungry ghost life human extravagance was as confusing then in 1998 in the Philippines as it is now in this day and age's increasingly polarization of perceived power and potential to influence suffering and or extravagance. And sovereignty calls to claim now what I knew then and continue to see now, that many, maybe even most, will look away from external suffering and do nothing about it. When I would look away from the light of life and other members of humanity that were suffering in immense poverty, I feel that resulted in immense internal suffering at not feeling I could do anything, and a confusion that those with the potential and power to change or influence human suffering did nothing to address collective internal and external human suffering and lack of safe or adequate shelter, and instead build fortresses of protection for any personal, external suffering while seemingly being poisoned by a lack of ability to address or give attention to the unmet needs of the heart or inner awareness. Out of that, an ability to not look at those members of humanity in deep suffering as human. After ignoring their own personal inner suffering for so long, somehow seeing those in poverty as somehow less than the other humans they worked alongside in the five-starred world of immense extravagant wealth. And maybe it's just to survive in a way. But at what cost? Is a compromised relationship with personal inner awareness largely responsible for collective compromise that suffering can't be changed? Sovereignty calls for sovereignty for all. And amidst so much internal pain and not looking away from suffering after meeting the cost of internal pain when I tried to look away, I don't know how I could endure the internal pain that would follow, or repeat the cycle of those with the most power and potential that ignore the calls of personal sovereignty for the collective amidst collective suffering. Sovereignty calls for sovereignty for all. I think I've rarely been able to find any tangible value in contributing to or following any cycle of seeking personal power with popular or perceived sovereignty at the expense of sovereignty for all. Not out of some moral high ground, but out of sensitivity to the suffering of others, amidst the recognition of my own suffering from unmet needs. So for a lot of reasons, I was confused what I could do that honored sovereignty's call for sovereignty for all after 1998. After 2001, that led me to a personal trainer school, a Bible college program, lots of layered learning at Whole Foods Market that I'll relay as holistic healing immersion, and studied political science, sociology, and pathology or biomedical engineering in college, before attempting to numb myself in alcoholism after a compounding experience of projection from bias towards my perspective that spoke to the unspoken. In both college with a professor and at my job with store management, the internalized unspoken struggled through many cycles of learning that lasted about a decade before impending physical concerns ignited my resolve to find sobriety. And 13 years before finding sobriety, I began with recognizing the unmet need of knowing and being known by others that I deeply relate to, not just work with. 3 years before I stopped drinking, I was driven to explore intentional community living in an attempt to know and be known. It was a beautiful experience that emphasized the extent of unmet needs, not only in the world at large, but uncovering the past's unmet needs within meaningful relationships and conversation, within intentional community. And even there, many unmet needs existed. And in my opinion, like every intentional community I've been in, there's not an equal sharing of the vulnerability that's a product of unmet safety needs that are unequally experienced and unequally supported. I remember being asked and pressured to perform a sketchy task on a sketchy ladder with minimal support and thinking, is this what the new people do? Because no one else will do it? And while it didn't happen there, I've heard many stories of new community members who left communities after being asked to do very sketchy things, to share the burden of the collective community's unmet needs with equal sharing of the collective community resources that are often allocated to the longer standing members, who for the most part have less unmet needs. Yet I wonder if they're plagued by the hungry ghost of extravagance and comfort. In my opinion, it's often the established community's control, management, and distribution of resources that is unable to maintain communities without more equal community distribution of resources between new and old members. And I believe this theme exists as a human experience. In every place there exists normalized dehumanization of part of the collective by another classified group to the collective, and the path to honor sovereignty's call for sovereignty for all is only found in places where there is freedom, safety, and a shared interest in sharing responsibility for unmet needs. And I feel in the midst of this conversation is a much simpler and maybe larger conversation on fear. While this first episode is not primarily on fear, I want to touch on this topic briefly and say, I wonder what the change in unmet needs after experiencing fear personally is due to. How do collective factors of perception and contribution for solutions and propagation of unmet needs impact the personal adaptation to the impact of fear? How is this changed by the quantity and magnitude of unmet needs? For those with less unmet needs, is fear more appropriate? Is fear more approachable with less compromise? What may be easily normalized for those with less unmet needs amongst that group and applied via social expectations to other groups with a larger magnitude of unmet needs? And in my opinion, more importantly, are the considerations around the influence of emotional health, quality of meaningful relationships, and relationships to one's own holistic health. For some, fear becomes a primary catalyst and component of addressing unmet needs to uncover or recover that which was lost, stolen, or unknown. It is such a profound and primary theme that its considerations are applied across the various themes and relationships throughout life. This incredible catalyst aligned my path time and time again by highlighting the theme of relatings, unmet needs, whether it be relating myself to others or feeling my experiences are relatable to others. It's been a significant challenge with unique opportunities. Some of the deepest unmet personal needs that were uncovered by fear become visible after heartbreak. It often uncovers a lack of balance in meeting unmet needs in relationships and brings an awareness that I'm not filling my own cup enough and instead trying to fill another's cup, hoping they'll fill my cup. And though it has authentic origins in the past to attempt to preserve relationships with partners who I tried to share in their vulnerability with unmet needs, there seems to be a point where compromised contribution to unmet needs results in compromise to change what's necessary to address unmet needs without propagating them. I've also been very aware of the tendency to normalize dysfunctional relationship dynamics within once-in-a-lifetime relationships with no external accountability, i.e., the husband and wife without a tribe, being codependent, and the normalization of cheating, affairs, and addiction. It was only after beginning to see a life coach and reading The Power of Now by Eckhart Tolle that I became aware of codependent dynamics. Having seen my contribution to codependent dynamics, most of which I was completely unaware of, I felt overwhelmed and terrified of the unchecked and unconscious ego. I did my best to kill the ego and remake my life anew. And it was the perfect grounds to uncover sobriety from alcohol a few years later. And while life was deeper and more filled with wonder and beauty after drinking, the calls of the unmet needs for my own sovereignty and sovereignty for all still called. In fact, they called louder, or rather clearer. And so I sought space to give attention to the unmet needs I saw through intentional meditation, energy healing, and more meaningful personal relationships based on shared values and interest, instead of relationships based on drinking. After several years of seeking healing and tools and education with so much passion, I became aware of the need for more responsible use of my energy and limitations of continuing to learn new practices like Kriya Yoga, indigenous ceremonies, and attend as many local events that came up as I could, while nurturing a single practice that was distilled amidst so much seeking. And the path of seeking, without sustainable integration, seemed unable to meet the depth of sovereignty's call to meet unmet needs. The past and ego call to be integrated, to heal the ego, to clarify sovereignty where it was distorted before, and balance, normalized compromise, made from a place of naivety. And for the last 2 years, I've been considering how far back the compromised choices from distortion go. And I feel it's to the beginning, or rather, the story of the beginning. I can't wait to share more in an upcoming episode about Adam and Eve. Generational healing in the masculine, the feminine, divinity and polarity. There's a lot of themes to unpack that are discussed in that topic. And lastly, I'll speak to what the present call for sovereignty's call for all shares today. And in the present, it's the consideration of the difference between how a martyr is remembered compared to how those who are massacred are remembered. Webster defines martyr as, quote, a person who sacrifices something of great value, and especially life itself, for the sake of principle. Wiki defines it as, quote, in the martyrdom narrative of the remembering community, this refusal to comply with the presented demands results in the punishment or execution of an individual by an oppressor. Accordingly, the status of the martyr can be considered a posthumous or proud title as a reward for those who are considered worthy of the concept of martyrdom by the living. regardless of any attempts by the deceased to control how they will be remembered in advance. And so far, the martyr is a relational figure of a society's boundary work that is produced by collective memory. Originally applied only to those who suffered for their religious beliefs, the term has come to be used in connection with people killed for a political cause. Webster defines massacre as, quote, the act or an instance of killing a number of usually helpless or unresisting human beings under circumstances of atrocity or cruelty. Part of the wiki page on massacre states, Robert Nelson, in 1982, in the context of Hamadian massacres, don't know how to say that again, used a basic working definition of, by massacre we shall mean the intentional killing by political actors of a significant number of relatively defenseless people. The motives for massacre need not be rational in order for the killings to be intentional. Mass killings can be carried out for various reasons, including a response to false rumors. Political massacre should be distinguished from criminal or pathological mass killings. As political bodies, we of course include the state and its agencies, but also non-state actors. Similarly, Levine attempts an objective classification of massacres throughout history, taking the term to refer to killings carried out by groups using overwhelming force against defenseless victims. He is accepting certain cases of mass executions, requiring that massacres must have the quality of being morally unacceptable. And I think it goes without saying that both are subject to death or cruelty as a result of a threat to an established authority, with the martyr's death being a certification of a heroic life. And I'm not trying to minimize the courage to speak to these social needs to those in power, but I can't help but wonder how many people were massacred as helpless victims of a single martyr whose name will die with those who were massacred. I wonder how often it happened, and I wonder how it still happens today. As I think of North Korea and many people's struggle for freedom in such an oppressive and controlling place, where families for generations are subject to massacre because of any ties to a martyr, to any facet related to the many structures of oppression within North Korea. And related to the broad view, I find it incredibly interesting how both the act of being martyred or massacred uniquely speak to unmet needs. The theme of martyrdom has been in my life for a while, and several deep considerations have been a part of that. I pondered for many years why it seems that the unmet needs that called for change for many years were only addressed after a martyr's voice was so loud that it carried beyond the grave. Yet an immense tragedy exists in the raised cries and voices of the massacred, where death seems less impactful. But why? Aren't the cries of the massacred the most significant human unmet needs for sovereignty's call for sovereignty for all? Isn't addressing those calls the path towards wholeness, healing the ego, generational healing, and balanced sharing in personal vulnerability? Yet as the massacred cry out for mercy for human life, those who don't face massacre still face their unmet needs. And I wonder why those cries for the unmet needs brought forth by the martyr seemingly impact more response and change. Healing the ego is both personal and collective, and I strive to bring attention to unmet needs and vulnerability to answer sovereignty's call for sovereignty for all, to examine the present clearly, accurately, and interpret what direction comes from protection and structure that's connected to life, and meet unmet needs personally and collectively. And while I feel I have important considerations to offer from my ego and experience for the collective, I also understand we must all create the collective together. And to bring wholeness to unmet needs, we need to be able to not only speak about them, but to discuss pragmatic solutions to integrate through meaningful cooperation and collaboration. Bestings.